Coming up next, we have a very special episode of Professor of Rock for you. First time we've ever done this. It was a year rock and roll dominated the airwaves and pop culture, and those who were desperately trying to control the status quo thought the world was coming to an end. These stories are crazy. You had a legendary lyricist who wrote one of the biggest hits of all time. He sold it for a couple of bucks. Then one of the most elegantly performed classics ever was written on a commode during a break. And then there was a song written by a teacher and a refrigerator repairman together that gave the greatest rock star ever his first #1 hit, plus a little kid who sang a love song that he never made a penny from. Instead, a notorious mobster took credit for the song. And finally, the scary song that's begun one of the most famous urban legends ever, where young sisters were threatened by a man with a knife to record one of the creepiest songs ever. And then when one refused, tragedy struck. But is the story true? We're going to find out next on Professor of Rock. Hey, music junkies, we're going back to the year that rock took over the airwaves. Many have requested it. Here we are. We're going to do it. I'm blown away at the songs and the stories and what I think is one of the best years in rock history. Rock and roll was king, much to the chagrin of worried and shell-shocked parents and the widely controlling moral leaders. Just a couple of years after the beginning of the rock era, many of the era's all-time classics were released in 1956. Here's our countdown of the top 10 of that pivotal year, 1956 in music. Coming in at number 10, one of the creepiest songs ever. Lyrics are pretty freaky. Tonight, You Belong to Me by Patience and Prudence. And the Lennon origin story behind the 1956 hit Tonight, You Belong to Me. Now, two sisters, Patience and Prudence, just 14 and 11, learned the old 1926 tune at camp, and they liked to sing it around the house. Well, their dad, Mark McIntyre, an orchestra leader and pianist, he worked at Liberty Records, and he heard him and thought it would make a sweet gift for their grandparents. So he recorded a simple demo. Nothing ambitious, just a family keepsake, really. Then the unexpected happened. That little demo struck a chord, and it got released, and it took off nationwide, selling over 1 million, and Liberty Records, teetering financially, was suddenly saved by its first top 10 hit ever. What started as a homemade present turned into a pop phenomenon. Tonight You Belong to Me by Patience and Prudence went to number 4 in the Billboard Hot 100.
Way down by the stream.
There's also a version of the song that was recorded by the Lennon sisters, which I mentioned, Kathy, Janet, Peggy, and Diane in 1956.
But tonight you belong to...
And this one created a fascinating and terrifying tale about the sisters being held at knife point to sing Tonight You Belong to Me by a man that lied about his identity. This dark story goes into detail about the sisters losing their parents in the war and were taken to a transitional shelter to relax. The strange man got angry when the tallest sister refused to sing the song and lip-synced, so he, did this. I can't say it on here. Definitely one of those creepy urban legends that sticks around because the song keeps turning up in horror films and TV shows, and most recently the song has been featured in several episodes of TV series American Horror Story. And it definitely presented it in a very eerie way. And it's a really eerie song if you listen to the lyrics. And actually on YouTube, the story about this urban legend, there's like 3 or 4 videos that have 7 to 10 million views each. And it's a total lie. Now, there was a tragedy, though. So the sisters had a wholesome, squeaky clean image and scored with the tune in 1956. But the idea that they were forced to sing at knife point or whatever, that's just a spooky story, not a real life event. Several fake stories, like I said, are making its way, and they still are, and people believe them. You'll see variations of the claim pop up online and on Instagram and stuff, often tied to the idea that the song lyrics can be used as coercion, but there's no factual footing to it. In short, a captivating legend, but not a documented incident. With the help of Lawrence Welk, the Lennon sisters' version of Tonight You Belong to Me went to number 15 on the Billboard Hot 100. Not as successful as the Patience and Prudence version, but a solid hit nonetheless. So here's the real tragedy that happened to the Lennon sisters. On August 12, 1969, tragedy struck in the parking lot of the Venice Golf Course in Marina del Rey, where their dad, William Lennon, was working as a private instructor. A man took his life who had earlier been confined to a state hospital and labeled dangerously insane. He'd escaped. Now, long before this, William Lennon had stepped away from steering his daughter's careers after having been on the set for every one of their TV appearances since 1955. So it was definitely a tragedy in a different way than the urban legend. All right, rocking into number 9 on our countdown of the top 10 songs at 56. I'm breaking my own rule here because we're going to have 2 appearances by this artist. It's Heartbreak Hotel by Elvis Yes. In the 1950s, mid-1950s, a school teacher and a former dishwasher refrigerator repairman teamed up to write a song. Now, they say it was sparked by a haunting line from a note of a man that took his own life, mentioned in the Miami Herald story. In that alleged note, with a line written by the deceased, it read, "I walk a lonely street." They portrayed a lonely place at the end of the line called Heartbreak Hotel. And who did they bring it to? The rising king of rock and roll, Elvis Presley himself. Tommy Durden, who was a repairman, he wrote the lyrics, and Mae Axton, the teacher, she taught English at DuPont High School in Jacksonville, Florida, composed the music. Mae was so confident in her songwriting skills, she made Elvis a promise. She said, "I'll write your first million-selling #1 hit." Now, RCA, his label, they hated the song. They thought it was a total dud. But Elvis, he believed in it. And then boom, Heartbreak Hotel explodes to #1. It sat there for 7 weeks, and it became the biggest song of the year. Now, the story of Heartbreak Hotel doesn't end there. Actually, Mae's son, Hoyt Axton, we've talked about him before, he would later pen Joy to the World for Three Dog Night, a #1 smash, making them the only mother and son duo in history to each write a chart-topping hit. Now, here's the twist that keeps the legend of Heartbreak Hotel buzzing, though. That supposed Miami Herald article with the note, no one's ever found solid proof that it even exists. No public records in Florida, no definitive clipping. It's been conclusively determined there's no such news article. It's just to tell this become an interesting part of rock and roll lore. Maxon's promise to Elvis was fulfilled, and then some. Heartbreak Hotel shot to #1 on the country, western, R&B, and Billboard Hot 100, all three charts. Top 10 Songs of 56 continues with In the Still of the Night by the Five Satins at #8. When the Five Satins walked into the studio that day, their big bet wasn't their slow burner that we know and love today. It was an up-tempo tune called The Jones Girl. That's the track the label pushed as the A-side. But radio DJs, they had other ideas. They actually flipped the single and started spinning the B-side instead. The B-side in Still of the Night. That caught fire on the East Coast, New York especially, where it climbed to #1 on the local charts. That dreamy shoo-doop, shoo-wee-doop, that hook, it didn't come out of nowhere. The group borrowed the feel from Tony Allen's 1955 song Night Out. Weaving it into their own sound and helping define the record's signature sway. Funny enough, though, when they recorded it, there were only 4 Satins in the room. The name Five Satins, that stuck anyway because it fit the era's trend of groups with 5 in the name. You know, the 5 Royals and the 5 Crowns. It was hotter to say 5 than 4, and so they kept it. This lineup, though, was always a bit in flux, with members coming and going, some off on military duty. So the roster shifted depending on who was around. So against all odds, a B-side ballad with a borrowed doo-wop shimmer became a stone-cold classic and one of the most endearing love songs of the doo-wop era. In the Still of the Night by the Five Satins, it was only a modest hit, though. It peaked at #24 on the Billboard Hot 100. But its legacy has evolved into being one of the most beloved doo-wop tunes ever recorded, one that everybody goes back to. And it's been remade a million times. Coming in at #7 on our Top 10 Songs of 56 countdown, it's a song written by Eternal Devotion by a man who eventually broke the tie that binds. It's I Walk the Line by Johnny Cash, the Man in Black.
I walk the line.
In 1954, 22-year-old Johnny Cash married Vivian Liberto. 10 months later, their daughter Roseanne was born. By the next year, Johnny Cash had signed with Sun Records, and he hit the road, often alongside Elvis Presley, who drew swarms of adoring fans. Temptation was everywhere. So Cash wrote himself a promise that he set to music. I Walk the Line.
I find it very, very easy to be true. I find myself.
It was his pledge to stay faithful to Vivian while he was out on tour. A vow that, as he later admitted, wasn't always easy to keep. Ironically, when the song exploded, the spotlight only intensified the pressure, with fame bringing a fresh flood of distractions and vices to Mr. Cash.
As night is dark and day is light, I keep you on.
Musically, the record, it had its own quirks. Cash would give a low, eerie hum at the start of each verse. That was actually his way of finding the right pitch, so he would hit the notes. Because the song shifts keys several times. The song's eerie melody came from what might call a happy accident, though. Years earlier in the Air Force, when Johnny was stationed in Germany, friends returned his reel-to-reel tape recorder with a tape. His band, the Landsberg Barbarians, spooled it on backwards, though. So when he played it, the sound was otherworldly. Like spooky church music is how he put it. It stuck with him. Pieces of that haunting feel found their way into I Walk the Line and became legendary.
Because you're mine, I walk the line.
A vow, a voice like a compass, and a melody born from a glitch. That's how Johnny Cash turned a personal promise into one of the best songs of '56 and one of the most enduring songs ever. Johnny's immortal I Walk the Line crossed over from country to pop glory, rising to #1 on the country and western chart and number 19 on the Billboard Hot 100.
I walk the line.
All right, at number 6, we have a man that many say is the real king of rock and roll, Mr. Chuck Berry with a rollover Beethoven. On the surface, it's a rallying cry for rock and roll to shove classical music right off the piano bench. Chuck's fiery spirit was lit up at his home. He was fed up with his sister Lucy hogging the family piano for her classical pieces. A lot of those sharp, funny lyrics were aimed at his sister Lucy more than at Beethoven. Chuck also laced the song with shout-outs to his heroes. The lyrics, early in the morning, that's a tip of the hat to Louis Jordan's 1947, Early in the Morning.
Early in the morning and I ain't got nothing but the blues.
And that punchy guitar intro was lifted from Jordan's 1946 track, Ain't That Just Like a Woman. I'm going to write a little letter, going to mail it to my local DJ. That salutes the DJs who made rock and roll explode, mainly with the highly influential DJ Alan Freed. As we've acknowledged many times on POR, you never know where a hit song is going to come from, and you never want to mess with a nasty groove. Now, in the case of Chuck Berry's rollover Beethoven, it came from a squabble between brother and sister. Maybe more accurate to call it a sibling rivalry with a battle between classically trained pianist Lucy and the self-taught rough and ready Chuck Berry. Lucy Berry and Chuck Berry. Actually, both of Chuck's sisters, Lucy and Thelma, were classically trained pianists, but it was Lucy that often banished her older brother from getting ivory time. Since Chuck became a huge international star, I think we could say he ultimately won the battle, the match with Lucy. Like I said, many say that Chuck Berry was the true king of rock and roll. I mean, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Elvis Presley, definitely one of the most 10 influential artists of the rock era for sure. And Rollover Beethoven was one of his greatest, working his way to number 2 in the R&B chart and number 29 on the Billboard Hot 100. Been covered countless times, most notably by the Beatles and ELO. Next on the countdown of the top 10 songs of 1956, it's another group of talented young singers. Why Do Fools Fall in Love by Frankie Lymon and the Teenagers at number 5 halfway through the countdown.
Why do fools fall in love? Why do they fall in love?
All right, so I'm going to take you back there as if you were there. Here's how Why Do Fools Fall in Love came to be, and why its story still stings nearly 70 years after its release. All right, let's go back to the mid-50s, to a hallway in a decrepit New York apartment building, where the Premiers, a teenage vocal group with a 12-year-old Frankie Lymon singing backup, are rehearsing, and a neighbor hands them a bundle of love letters his girlfriend wrote, all in verse. The guys read through them, and they pick a poem called Why Do Birds Sing So Gay?
Do birds sing so gay? And love was my way.
And they start shaping it into a song. Word gets around. Richard Barrett of the Valentines tips off label owner George Goldner, who calls an audition. Lead singer Herman Santiago, he was sick that day. So the little kid Frankie, who's not quite a teenager yet, steps up to sing lead. Goldner loves the tune, but wants lyrical changes. He signs the group to G Records. The song gets reworked into Why Do Fools Fall in Love, and when they hit the studio with band leader Jimmy Wright, he suggests a new name, The Teenagers.
Love is a losing game, and love can be ashamed.
But the single slips out in January of '56. In fact, they didn't even tell the group that the song had been released. Actually found out when classmates started singing it at school. Without much fanfare, it takes off, hitting number 6 on the charts despite competing covers by Gail Storm and the Diamonds that go to number 9 and number 12, 3 different versions. Now, the impact of Why Do Fools Fall in Love, it was enormous. Frankie Lymon and the Teenagers opened doors for young black groups, paving the way for acts like the Jackson 5 and others. But Lyman's story is so heartbreaking. An enormous talent pushed into the spotlight too soon. He actually died of a heroin overdose at 26. And behind the music sat a tangle of rights and royalties. In 1956, George Goldner told the group only 2 names could go on the copyright. He credited himself and Lymon. And years later, in 1964, he signed over the rights to Morris Levy, one of the biggest jerks in music history. Of course, he'd become notorious for attaching his name to songs he didn't write and collecting royalties from major artists like Chuck Berry and Tommy James, amongst many others. The disputes over who really owned and profited from Why Do Fools Fall in Love dragged on for decades. This iconic song performed by Frankie Lymon and the Teenagers was a runaway smash. It rocketed number 1 on the R&B chart and number 1 in the UK and number 6 on the Billboard Hot 100. But Frankie Lymon died penniless and allegedly didn't make a penny from the royalties from that song. Coming in at number 4, I've got a song with one of the craziest contradictions of the rock era. Talking about The Great Pretender by the Platters. A shining veneer, a hidden hurt. Man, that's the genius of The Great Pretender, performed beautifully by the Platters, one of the most successful vocal groups of the burgeoning rock and roll era. The Great Pretender was not the first doo-wop song, for sure, but it was hugely influential and helped define the genre for the mainstream audience. The term doo-wop, that wasn't coined until around 1961. The musical style had roots in earlier R&B and vocal harmony groups for sure. But the Platters' signature ballad, The Great Pretender, it was one of the first. It was created out of urgency, though, in a most unsavory place. Producer-songwriter Buck Ram needed a quick follow-up to the group's breakout hit, Only You. Mercury Records executive Bobby Shad was all over him about it. Now, Buck already had a title rattling around in his head, but he had no song. Just to pacify the label executive, though, he told him the next song for the Platters was going to be The Great Pretender. Bobby asked him to sing it for him on the spot. But of course, Buck didn't have anything, so he bought some time. He told Bobby he had to go to Vegas to be with the band, but he would deliver the song the moment that he returned. On his way to join the Platters in Vegas, he thought, oh man, I gotta write that song. So mid-show at the Flamingo Hotel, he ducked into the men's room. He went into a stall, sat on the porcelain god, and in roughly 20 minutes, he sketched the aching confession that would become the desperation captured a timeless paradox, though. The smooth crooner masking a bruised heart. It's, of course, an example of what a human being can do under extreme pressure, the composition of artistic elegance in an environment of human waste. On the recording of The Great Pretender, you can hear the Platters' vocal blend wrapped in a soft halo, though. And if you listen really closely, you can hear the gliding harmony of Zola Taylor, the group's sole female member, would later become Frankie Lymon's second wife, and actually she was portrayed by Halle Berry in the film Why Do Fools Fall in Love.
Warner Brothers presents Halle Berry.
She remained a vital part of the Platters sound before a stroke took her life in 2007 at, I believe she was 69. Now, The Great Pretender went from the crap house to the penthouse, rocking number 1 on the R&B chart and on the Billboard Hot 100. Well, like I said in the beginning of this episode, rock and roll scared the life out of parents and the religious zealots who thought that rock was, from the devil. Ironically, the song at number 3 was adopted by many from those circles. It's Little Richard with his PG-13 version of Tutti Frutti. Now, before it blasted on the radios as a whirlwind of nonsense syllables and rocket-fueled piano, Tutti Frutti lived a far wilder life on the Southern club circuit. Little Richard hustling gigs by night and washing dishes at a Macon, Georgia bus station by day. He worked up an early version that was as raw as his stage presence. An unabashed, risque celebration of desire that set dance floors ablaze long before the song ever saw a studio. So in September 1955 in New Orleans at a delayed specialty record session, a restless Little Richard had a lunch break that changed rock and roll history forever. Fed up with the lack of spark in the studio, Richard slipped over to the Dewdrop Inn, he hopped on the piano, and he let loose the torrid club version he'd been perfecting on stage. It was raw, it was explosive, and it was impossible to ignore. Now, of course, the original song was it was about something that, of course, I can't say on here, but maybe you can read into these lyrics. Listen closely. The original lyrics were Tutti Frutti, good booty. If it don't fit, don't force it. You can grease it, make it easy. Yeah, it's about, Producer Robert Bumps Blackwell heard it and he knew instantly. The beat was a rocket, the performance was a revelation. But there was a big hurdle. Those gleefully explicit lyrics, electric in a nightclub, they would never fly on 1950s radio. The mission was challenging but clear. Keep the fire, tame the words, and bottle that light. The clock ticking, producer Bumps Blackwell called in New Orleans songwriter Dorothy Labastrie to rescue that session. Little Richard, shy about the song's original words, mumbled them toward the studio wall while Labastrie listened and pen just flying, across, writing the lyrics. Within minutes, she refashioned the lyric, swapping the body punchlines for playful hooks like Tutti Frutti, Ah Rudy, slang for all right, and name checks for Sue and Daisy. They cut the new version really fast. 3 takes, about 15 minutes, powered by Richard's pounding piano and unbridled fire. The rocket was ready for radio. Tutti Frutti received much more airplay on the R&B stations, though, leading to a number 2 finish on the R&B chart. On the Billboard Hot 100, it peaked at number 17, but as time went on, Tutti Frutti became just as well known as Juicy Fruit Gum, and a sing-along classic that was like a nursery rhyme, covered by the Beatles, Elvis, and shockingly, Pat Boone, whose version did better than Little Richard. Pat must not have had a clue about the lyrical content, or would have never recorded a version of that song given his staunch religious beliefs and his, anyway. Grabbing the number 2 spot on our top 10 countdown of 56 is a song whose origin is shrouded by myths and conjecture. It's the infectious Bebop-A-Lula by Gene Vincent and the Blue Cap. The origin of Bebop-A-Lula is one of those rock and roll myths that has never reached a full conclusion. It's part of the song's charm, though. The official tell, pushed by Gene Vincent and his label, goes like this. Vincent, laid up for 6 months at Portsmouth Naval Hospital after a motorcycle crash, strummed his guitar, stared at the little Lulu comic strip in front of him, and dreamed up the song on the spot. Now, that might not be true, but it may be true. Dickie Harrell, drummer for Vincent's Blue Caps, told Mojo in 2000 that the real author was a Portsmouth local named Donald Graves. According to Dickie, Vincent and his manager Bill Sheriff Tex Davis bought the song from Graves for $25, standard practice back then when quick cash spoke louder than future royalties. Another version splits the difference. Vincent and Graves wrote it together, then Graves sold his share for that same $25. I mean, pick whichever legend you want to believe, but what's indisputable is what happened next. Recorded in Nashville on May 4th, 1956, Bebop-A-Lula first limped out as the B-side to a sultry number called Woman Love. U.S. radio wanted no part of Woman Love, and the BBC banned it, so Capitol flipped the single, and suddenly Bebop-A-Lula was the A-side, and the fuse was lit.
She's the woman that loves me, so say Bebop-A-Lula.
Capitol Records had been hunting hard for their own Elvis. Now, Gene Vincent, born just 34 days after Presley, had the sneer, he had the leather, and the unteachable cool that they wanted. They bet on Gene Vincent, and it paid off big time. Bebop-A-Lula, Vincent's debut single, moved over 200,000 copies in his first month and cemented him as a cult idol with a voice that sounded like it had a curl in its lip, a la the King. Now, when Bebop-A-Lula first came out, many listeners thought it was Elvis. It's reported that Elvis's own mother thought it was her son singing the song. She totally said, "I love that new song you have," and he had to set her straight.
Bebop-A-Lula, she my baby.
But the rebel image wasn't just for show. I mean, Gene Vincent, he had a wild lifestyle, lived a wild lifestyle, battling painkillers, speed, and alcohol. In 1960, he survived the car crash in England that took the life of his close friend, rockabilly hero Eddie Cochran. Songwriter Sharon Sheely was injured in the accident but lived. Gene Vincent's own life was tragically brief. He died in 1971 of an ulcer, and he was only 36. Bebop-A-Lula was a top 10 smash, though, hitting number 7 on the Billboard Hot 100 and number 8 on the R&B chart. It was one of the most influential tracks of its time, influencing some of the all-time greats, Everly Brothers, Carl Perkins, and the Beatles. It's actually the first 45 that Paul McCartney ever bought. Speaking of Carl Perkins, that's where our honorable mention comes in, Blue Suede Shoes. Of course, Elvis had a version and Carl had a version that both went to the top 10.
Don't you step on my blue suede shoe.
And if you can believe it, Carl Perkins wrote this about naval shoes. There were the black shoes, and he said, "Don't step on my blue suede shoes." He was pretending they were blue suede shoes. Because blue suede shoes were a shoe that you wore when you were going to go out and have a good time in the South. They call them blue suede shoes. But he was wearing just his black naval shoes. And when he said, "Don't step on my blue suede shoes" as a joke, he actually wrote it down on a potato sack and it became a massive hit. And actually, it was Carl Perkins' only hit. He was a one-hit wonder. That's crazy.
But don't you step on my blue suede shoe.
We're up to number one. And you know, until 1956, the term double single or double A-side, it hadn't hit the industry vernacular yet. But in that year, the term and the concept came to the scene in a historic way. Number one on our countdown of the top 10 of 56 is the super double single combination of Don't Be Cruel and Hound Dog by the King, Elvis Presley.
Don't be cruel to who heart that's true. You ain't nothing but a hound dog, you're crying all the time.
I'm breaking my own rule here by including several songs by the same artist. I don't do that in these top countdowns, give everybody a chance. But this is Elvis we're talking about here. So let's start out with Don't Be Cruel. That song didn't just fall into Elvis's lap. It hustled its way there, courtesy of Otis Blackwell, one of rock and roll's great behind-the-scenes hit makers. Blackwell wrote a stack of Elvis staples: Don't Be Cruel, Return to Sender, All Shook Up, One Broken Heart for Sale, and his fingerprints are all over that era. Fever, of course, immortalized by Peggy Lee, and Great Balls of Fire for Jerry Lee Lewis. Now, he died in 2002 at 70. But his songs have never left radio or other mediums of pop culture.
You know I can be found sitting home all alone.
The origin story of Don't Be Cruel unfolded on Christmas Eve in 1955. I'll take you back there as if you were there. So Blackwell's standing outside the Brill building in the cold pouring rain. He's trying to sell songs. A friend, guitarist arranger Leroy Kirkland, asks if he's got anything. And he does. He's got 6 songs worth. Over the next week, he sold them to Shalimar Music for $25. Don't Be Cruel is included. Blackwell cuts demos. Shalimar shipped them to Elvis. Fast forward to July 2nd, 1956. RCA Studios in New York, and Elvis and the band had just ripped through Hound Dog. They need a flip side, though. They started auditioning demos and hit on Blackwell's Don't Be Cruel. Elvis loved it. 20 minutes of woodshedding later, they cut the track with Presley following Blackwell's fill right down to the pocket. When the dust settled, it was obvious. This was no B-side. They released it as a double A-side with Hound Dog, and together those records helped define the sound and charisma of Elvis at full blast and rock and roll together.
It's just you I'm thinking of. Don't be
All right, let's flip the record over to Hound Dog.
you ain't never caught a rabbit and you ain't no friend of mine.
Before it was Elvis's hip-shaking anthem, Hound Dog was Big Mama Thornton's Growl. She, of course, cut it in 1953. It was a tough blues-drenched stomp that hit number one on the R&B charts and became the defining record of her career. But like too many blues greats before her, she didn't see much money from it at all. But her influence ran deep. Of course, years later, Janis Joplin would belt Thornton's Ball and Chain into rock history, if you remember that.
Went on this Caribbean thing.
But Elvis didn't pick up Hound Dog straight from Big Mama's record. He caught it Vegas style. In 1956, during a 2-week booking at the New Frontier, he wandered down the Strip and into the Sahara Lounge, where Freddie Bell and the Bell Boys were tearing through a jokey, high-energy version of the song.
You ain't nothing but a hound dog, hound dog.
And man, Elvis loved the feel, and he swiped their arrangement. That's why his lyrics mirrored Bell's rewrite rather than Thornton's original. The song itself, that came from 2 teenage firecrackers, Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller. They wrote most of Hound Dog in a car, Stoller thumping a buck dance rhythm on the roof. They raced to Johnny Otis's house, and Stoller went straight to the piano, cigarette in his mouth, not even sitting down, and the song just came tumbling out. When they brought it to Big Mama, she snatched the lyric sheet and barked, "Is this my big hit?" Lieber told her, "I hope so." He was right. Elvis turned their blues into a rock and roll detonation, and it changed everyone's fortunes forever. On the strength of Hound Dog, Lieber and Stoller became go-to hit makers for the King, eventually crafting songs for him and writing the score to Jailhouse Rock. Still, they weren't thrilled with Elvis's take. It was nervous sounding, is what Lieber would say. He'd say it didn't have that insinuation that Big Mama's record had. Fair point. Thornton's version smolders, but Elvis's explodes. Either way, Hound Dog proved it could shapeshift and still bite wherever you were listening.
You ain't nothing but a hound dog, crying all the time.
We're talking about the gold standard of double-sided singles, double A-sides. Elvis set it in stone. Hound Dog and Don't Be Cruel didn't just share a slab of vinyl. They tag-teamed the charts. One side, Don't Be Cruel, hit number 1. The other, Hound Dog, climbed to number 2. And together, they camped out on Billboard's Top 100 for a staggering 55 weeks across 1956 to 1957. In the rock era, not even the Beatles managed a two-sider with that kind of combined firepower. It was a complete takeover by Elvis Presley. Of course, that's why he was anointed the king of rock and roll.
Rabbit, you ain't no friend of mine.
Hey, thanks so much for watching. That's my first stab at the 50s. Did you like it? Should we do more? Should we cover more? There's so much out there. And there's so many great stories behind these 50s songs. I mean, there's better stories than even the 60s and the 70s. Let's share our memories below. What would you like to see next? Should we cover 1955? Should we cover 1958? Let us know. And if you like our content, we invite you to subscribe. We'd love to have you as part of our community. Until next time, 3 chords and the truth, my friends.